Welcome, everyone, to the Kuyperian Commentary Podcast. This is episode 112. We've had a little bit of a break this summer, but we're back and ready to go. And today we're going to be talking to Dr. Andrew Sandlin about his recently republished book, A Postmillennial Primer. Dr. Sandlin, if you don't know, is the founder and president of the Center for Cultural Leadership in Coulterville, California. And we're really happy to have him on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you, Rick. I've been on the Kuyperian podcast before, but it's been a little while, so it's great to be back.
This is the new Kuyperian podcast with the less handsome host.
Certainly the less Brazilian.
There you go, the less Brazilian host. I just want to say this is my first time meeting you, but this isn't my first time reading you, because when I was becoming Reformed over 20 years ago in college, just reading everything on the internet, those were the days when everyone was friends with everybody. There was no Federal Vision and
right.
Sproul and Doug Wilson, and everybody could be together. I remember reading you on Razormouth. That was my first experience of Dr. Andrew Sandlin. Was
Joe Miller. I remember. Oh, that was so many years ago. Yeah.
Been a long time. So this is kind of a book from back in those days, right? I mean, this was originally published when 90, 98, 99, somewhere around there.
Yes, it was. I wrote it. I was at the Chalcedon Foundation at the time when we published it, and I thought there was kind of a demand for it. It wasn't in print. There were a few copies floating around here and there. I think I checked on the Amazon and the internet, and they were astronomically expensive. So I thought, I think maybe we ought to reprint it. And there are, of course, some typographical errors in the original, and also expand it. So I did it, and I've been humbled by the demand. It's sold remarkably well, and I'm very grateful for that. So thanks for having me on to talk about it.
Yeah, well, it's it's an impressive little introduction to postmillennialism. When I was being introduced to millennial positions, someone handed me, I was a freshman in college, someone handed me Lorraine Bettner's book on the millennium, which is, big, thick book. And, even then, there were a lot of people, a lot of articles online promoting postmillennialism, but just a nice little one-stop workshop on here's what it's about didn't really exist at the time, I don't think. So I think it's good to have. You said you updated it a little bit. One thing I wanted to ask you about is just sort of the lie of the land as far as biblical views of end times. I mean, when the book was published, it was late 90s, 9/11 hadn't happened. We hadn't had the Iraq War. For a lot of people, it looks like our culture is in a big downhill slide, just free fall. Do you think people are attracted to postmillennialism because of that, or do you think that hinders people from coming to a postmillennial view of eschatology?
I think they're attracted. I know it might sound counterintuitive that in a time like ours, that is, at least in the United States, culturally more degraded than when I first wrote it, you would think that there would be a pervasive pessimism, and therefore the postmillennialism, which is an optimistic vision about the advancement of the kingdom gospel, would be less attractive. But I've actually found that's not true. And I think one reason, perhaps the main reason for that, is when people see that things are so bad in the church and bad in the culture, they want to do something about it. They want to get involved in the battle. And once they get involved in the battle, they certainly want to see that there is a possibility of victory.
Yeah.
And that is precisely what postmillennialism offers. And of course, pragmatism is not the main reason to embrace it. We have to embrace it because it's what the Bible teaches. But I think that there's an openness, at least, to postmillennialism because of that hunger for victory in the battles we're facing. So people are willing to re-examine these issues. So I think more and more people actually are becoming postmillennial. I think per capita today than even 25 or 30 years ago when it was first really revived in the late 20th century.
That's what it seems like. I mean, there's a lot of interest right now. Sometimes postmillennialism is presented as kind of an aberration, where amillennialism within the Reformed world is the default position. And I've found that myself, throughout the Reformed world. And postmillennialism is kind of the weird, they're there. We know they're there, but we don't approve wholeheartedly. But you have a chapter in this book that's kind of dedicated. I don't know if it was in the original, but it's I'm trying to remember what the chapter's called. It's the confessional.
Postmillennialism, yeah,
Yeah,
confessional post. Yes, no, it
confessional
wasn't in the original.
postmillennialism.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about that, because I think most people say either the Reformed confessions don't touch on eschatology, or if they do, they lean in an amillennial kind of direction. But you argue that's not the case.
No, it's not actually. And there's some learned, historically aware amillennialists that are aware that before, the middle of or late of the last century in England and the United States, most Reformed or Presbyterian people were actually postmillennial. Now, I need to make clear that language, post-mill, amill, pre-mill, is fairly recent language. So the issue is not the language. The issue is the position. And I believe that Marcellus Kick, in his book on eschatology of victory, actually historically demonstrates this fact that what we today call amillennialism, certainly the pessimistic version of amillennialism that many Reformed people hold, is actually fairly new historically. Calvin, for example, why it might not be correct to call his position specifically postmillennial, had a victorious feature to his millennial views and his eschatology. The point I'm making in that book is if you look at the confessions, including Westminster, and particularly a confession not as well known today, it's the Savoy Declaration of the Congregational Churches, but very Reformed, not Presbyterian in its policy, but nonetheless Calvinistic, very much so, was explicitly postmillennial. What I do in that chapter is show that a number of the proof texts that are in the sections on eschatology in the Westminster Confession can best be interpreted in a postmillennial way. I'm not suggesting they were all card-carrying postmillennialists, but they certainly were not premill, and their interpretation of those texts, it fits much more with postmillennialism than it does with what we today call amillennialism. Amillennialism, that's what the chapter is basically about.
Yeah, so what prompted the slide from that optimistic view of the future that the Reformers, the Puritans had, certainly the English Reformers had that. What prompted the slide from that into more of a kind of maybe an agnostic amillennialism that says we just don't know, or a more pessimistic outlook on the future?
Yeah, that's a good question, Rick. I think several factors. I think one of them is the emergence. This was actually early in the 19th century, but it didn't really take hold in the United States until later, of dispensationalism by J.N.D. Darby in Plymouth in England. And of course, that was sort of transmitted. He came over to the United States and taught a lot. And then, of course, the just remarkable development and sale of the Scofield Reference Bible, printed of all places in Oxford by Oxford University Press, was just sort of transmitted to all sorts of evangelicals. That's one thing. Another thing was sort of a revived pietism in the worst sense. The original pietists were basically good guys, but pietism in the 19th century developed the notion that the only thing that's really important is our sort of privatized personal relationship to God, or as my friend Stephen Perk says, a private worship hobby, private devotional hobby. And the idea of culture and history is something that's not terribly important. A third thing, actually, is a revived notion, and dispensationalists help this, of the nation of Israel as an actual political state, and reviving the nation of Israel and keeping Israel as a people distinct from the church in biblical interpretation. And that really is the foundational tenet, hermeneutical tenet of dispensationalism. And that's why there's this radical divide between Old and New Testament, Jew and Gentile, the millennium and the church, rapture, and all of that. There were, of course, secular factors, the rise of Darwinism and higher criticism. And so Christians in general felt under attack. And so I think they felt, Rick, pushed back into their churches, saying, well, things in the culture are bad. Let's just keep our church pure and our families pure, and everything will be all right. Well, as we found out, everything wasn't all right, because the church also went apostate, and families also fell into, and many of them, into apostasy and sin. So those are kind of some of the factors that I would consider contributing to this problem.
Yeah, you say at one point in your book, this is right near the beginning, about the nature of the people of God, that it's the believers in Christ who are the people of God, singular. Some dispensationalists refer to this fact negatively as replacement theology. What they should grasp is that replacement theology is Orthodox Christian theology. I like
Yes.
that line. I think that's a really scary term people like to use, replacement theology, because it's tied
Yes.
to you're an anti-Semite somehow.
Yeah.
You hate Jews.
Yeah, that's certainly false. I know some people that embrace it, of course, are anti-Semitic, but there is probably, this is, I guess, an ironic point, Rick. Aside from dispensationalists themselves, there's probably no sector of the church historically that has a greater love for and a higher regard for Jews than the Reformed.
Yeah.
And it's precisely because of their, in many cases, like John Murray's interpretation of Romans chapter 11. Some don't hold this, but I hold the view that there is a great and glorious future for ethnic Israel, not Israel as a state or a nation. That's a separate issue. But I interpret Romans 11 to teach, like Murray, that there will one day be a great number of Jews that'll be converted, not separately, with a separate covenant, as the dispensationalists would say, but of course within the church. They come to recognize their Messiah. They come into the church of Jesus Christ. So, but technically what's called replacement theology, that is that the church of Jesus Christ has replaced ethnic Israel as the covenant people of God. I would say that just an ordinary reading of the New Testament would verify that as just good standard Christian hermeneutics. And if you hold another view that these two have to be separate, it runs right in the face of what Paul and other writers, but particularly Paul, again and again and again in the New Testament.
Yeah. Well, I was recently listening to a lecture series on Augustine's City of God, and I can't remember the lecturer at the time who was doing it, but he even brought that up, as if this is just common among the church fathers to speak of the church as having replaced ethnic Israel. But of course, he had to say, he said, this is Augustine's belief. Now, we know today that this is very problematic.
Yeah, we are much wiser. We are much wiser today, obviously, than Augustine was.
For 1900 years, they weren't aware of how problematic it was. So isn't that also the thesis? I haven't read the book. I've heard good things about it. The Puritan Hope.
Yes. No, that's right. It's a great book by Ian Murray. He's pointing out that though not all Puritans held this view, most of them held a very optimistic view of eschatology. And I would add this also was behind a lot of the 18th and particularly the 19th century push for missions and great worldwide missions. And of course, this influenced many more than the Calvinists. There were, of course, a lot of Arminians and Baptists that also, though they're, I believe, mistaken in their theology, nonetheless recognize this great optimistic vision of the gospel, that it would be a success. And I would say that theologically, we could not have had the great missionary age in the 19th and early 20th centuries. We could not have had it apart from postmillennialism. And I would also say as postmillennialism died, basically late 19th, early 20th century, and kind of cooled off, that strong missionary urge kind of gradually, and there's a lag time, but gradually today, there's very little of it. But among postmillennialists, there's a revived push to get the gospel out to the world.
Yeah. I see that even here in Lynchburg. I was a student at Liberty University back in the day, and Jerry Falwell had that big vision, even though very dispensational school. The three valid positions Christians could argue for were not pre-mill, amill, post-mill. They were pre-tribulational rapture,
mid-tribulational, and post-trib. Yeah,
those were what Christians believed, and that was where you're limited to. But even there, you see, this almost post-millennial vision of victory somehow coming through theology that should, if logically followed out, stamp that out.
Jerry Falwell Sr. was he was happily inconsistent, and he did not allow his dispensationalism to impact his view of the world. And he would have been influenced by people like Francis Schaeffer, who, though himself was not postmillennial, nonetheless had that sort of positive vision on cultural engagement. I would say that anybody that develops a sincere, robust vision of cultural engagement, even if they're not theologically postmillennial, are going to have to compartmentalize their theology and sort of bracket it off because they're acting as a postmillennialist would.
Yeah. So we've got that dispensationalism, I think, still at play in a lot of the Baptist church today. Do you see that? You dedicate a chapter to it in your book here. Do you see that as big a cultural force among Christians as it was maybe 20 years ago when you wrote this book?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that dispensationalism is dying in the seminaries, but is very alive among sort of folk,
Mm,
popular evangelicals. I would say that if you went to a lot of just ordinary Baptist, and I don't mean the Reformed Baptist, but ordinary sort of Southern Baptist or Independent Baptist
mm,
and Bible churches and, conservative congregational community churches, I would say that most of them are at least default committed to at least a generic
mm.
dispensationalism. Certainly, if not the tight view of dispensations, nonetheless, Rick, to the idea that we're living in the end times and Christ is coming very soon. We need to get ready for it. And looking at things happening over in the Middle East as signs that we're only going to be around a few more years.
Yeah.
So yes, it's still around, not academically so much at all, but definitely among popularly it is. So there's a conflict between this sort of resurgence of postmillennialism and the sort of retention
Mm.
of pop dispensationalism, I'd like to call it.
So, and Left Behind hasn't been left behind then all the way.
No, it
Still
is
waiting to
not.
be left behind.
It's waiting. I'm waiting for it to be left behind, but it's still
Yeah,
here.
it's still there. I want to swing our conversation sort of to the other pole here. When I became postmillennial in college, what went along with that, and one thing that really sparked it for me, one of the things that was holding me to dispensationalism, uh, and that kind of snapped that line, I read R.C. Sproul's book, The Last Days According to Jesus.
Yes.
Such a great book, sort of putting Jesus's prophecies of the destruction of the temple in the first century, right? It happened just like
Yes.
Jesus prophesied. We're not waiting for another temple in the future to be built. You have a chapter in the book dedicated, though, to sort of the worldview that takes that a little farther. So, the idea that, just for listeners, viewers who may not know, the idea that Jesus's prophecies of the temple's destruction happened in the first century. That's preterism, is what it's called, partial preterism. But we've seen some people sort of swinging the pendulum all the way to the other side into what's called full preterism, which says there are no prophecies in the Bible that haven't been fulfilled. It's all finished, Genesis to Revelation, done. Why do you think that's suddenly becoming? I mean, it's been lurking in the wings for years. Why is it suddenly rushing in? It seems like in a bigger way than it has before.
Yeah, I was really popular in the 80s and 90s, and its resurgence, I think part of it is precisely a response to all of the sort of left behind stuff, because actually it is the quickest way to dispose of the left behind last days madness by just saying, well, the best way to dispose of that is to tell you that there aren't any more last days ever of any kind, that all of the last days are over, that Jesus coming in judgment in AD 70 and the destruction of Jerusalem is the final definitive parousia, the final coming. As I point out in the book, there are just several severe problems with that exegetically and theologically. And R.C. Sproul, though I agree with him in partial preterism. I don't see how you can read the Bible and not be a New Testament and be a partial preterist. Though good people disagree, I think it's fairly clear to me. But there's some biblical texts, like Sproul points out, some in First Thessalonians and others, that can't be interpreted in any way other than referring to what has conventionally been known as what we call the second coming, the second parousia.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of problems we don't have time to go into now. I think people don't understand that word coming can be used in a number of senses, and that similar language can be used for different events. That happens all the time in the Bible. So, hyperpreterism is actually a heresy because it really stands outside the Orthodox creeds. The creeds are not infallible. I like what somebody said. The creeds don't have more authority than the Bible, but they do have more authority than you and me. So we bind ourselves to these creeds, and everybody's creedal to some degree.
Yeah.
But it's not just the creeds. As I try to point out in that chapter, there's some biblical texts that seem quite clearly to indicate that there is to be this second coming. So the church has not been wrong historically on these issues, although the church often has been wrong about secondary issues like preterism, that is mild or partial preterism. I think that as far as that's concerned, there is no biblical prophecy more evident in the New Testament that is less emphasized today than the destruction of Jerusalem. You look at the foreboding. There's this foreboding around what Jesus says again and again about this destruction of the Jews if they don't accept him. And of course they don't, and he predicts their destruction. And Paul does the same thing, and other writers do the same thing. And yet with the foreboding, there's also a joy that with the turning away from ethnic Israel, that's how the gospel can go to the world. God will
Yeah.
embrace the world. So it's on the one sense foreboding, on the other hand, a sense of joy. So, but hyperpreterism is a severe problem, and it is a heresy.
Yeah. One of the things I've seen, and then I like the creedal emphasis there, because one of the things I've seen in my slight interaction with hyperpreterism is sort of a really hard biblicism that wants to reject the creeds. And along with that, you almost have to have this view that as soon as the apostles died, the church was basically immediately taken over with Greek philosophy, and
Yeah.
we lost all our understanding of what the Bible actually means, and the creeds are all tainted in somehow with Greek philosophy. Is there something pastors, you think, need to be doing to push back against this? Do you think this is something that's growing? Do you think it's still a fringe thing that isn't really a challenge at this point? Or do you think it's something that pastors need to be confronting in a very specific way?
Well, it depends on the pastor and church. I don't see it as much in, like, you wouldn't see it as much in conservative Lutheran or other church, but certainly in Reformed churches, and precisely because Reformed people are very open to postmillennialism. And partial preterism goes hand in glove, in my view, with postmillennialism. Although you certainly don't have to be a preterist to be a postmillennialist. Jonathan Edwards wasn't, R.J. Rushdoony wasn't, Bettner wasn't, but certainly they tend to go together pretty well. So yeah, I think pastors do need to not make a hobby horse about it, but they need to warn their flock. And one thing to do is actually there needs to be strong teaching first on biblical exegetical eschatology, but also on the importance of creeds and confessions. And the fact is, everybody's a creedalist. I mean, the hyperpreterists have their own little hyperpreterist creed, basically, their own little orthodoxy. So the question is, are we going to at least give deference to what virtually all Christians everywhere for 1800 to 2000 years have believed? And it's ironic that the three main things that the hyperpreterists deny are the three things on which all Christians have agreed: future bodily resurrection, future final judgment of the righteous and the unrighteous, and future the parousia. Those three things, Christians historically have disagreed on about everything eschatologically. It's amazing that the hyperpreterists want to disagree on the things they have all agreed on. I think that's a significant point.
Yeah. What do you think leads someone down that path?
A couple things is people that have been influenced by, or at least very disturbed by, dispensationalism. Another one is, I think, people that love the Word of God, but I like your language of hard biblicism. The Bible is the inspired and infallible, inerrant Word of God that trumps everything else. But the Bible itself doesn't teach that the Bible is the only authority. It's the final propositional authority. But the church itself, historically, in a secondary sense, a derivative sense, has authority. Pastors, of course, have authority. The state, properly, in a limited sense, has authority. Families have authority. In this sense, of course, obviously, Christianity as a historical objective fact has authority. A lot of them are basically, this may sound very odd to some people, Rick, basically they're sort of hermeneutically antinomian. They basically are lawless, law to themselves. And I've talked to them. In fact, one of the leaders that you probably know, formerly a dear friend of mine, I asked him, I said, "Now, do you really think that God has just laid this truth out for you just over the last 30 years and nobody until you and a few others came along understood this truth?" Well, and I asked him that person, but he didn't have a good answer for that. I mean, his is, well, I read my Bible. Well, of course, what do you think? These people that deny hyperpreterism don't read their Bibles? Well, of course, they've been reading their Bibles. But I think there's not a real appreciation for how the church, see, the important thing is not only exegesis that we do. The important thing is the exegesis that has been done historically for 1700 years.
Yeah.
So we are not the first people that exegeted the Bible. Not that their exegesis is infallible. But if we question their exegesis, we also probably ought to question ours. And many hyperpreterists don't do that.
Yeah. I like Keith Matheson, I think, was the one who coined the term sola scriptura.
Yes.
Versus sola. Solo, just me and my Bible. We can figure
it out.
And
the Bible's never meant to be read that way.
Well, we've talked a little bit about sort of dispensationalism. That's sort of the extreme on the more Baptist evangelical side. hyper-preterism is sort of the more reformed other side danger. Just let's back up here at the very end, I think, and do a big general question. I love John MacArthur, but he's famous for the quote, "We lose down here." That's a
Yeah.
soundbite that's been shared over and over. We lose down
Right.
here. Who's going to lose? In your book, your last chapter is entitled "Why We Will Win."
Yes.
So, why is an eschatology of why we will win more powerful than an eschatology of we lose down here?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that as we read the Bible, and I think one thing I probably point out in the book, early in the book, is that eschatology presupposes protology. Eschatology is last things, protology is first things. Well, right there in the beginning, in the proto-evangelium in Genesis 3:15 about the crushing of the serpent's head, that's the first gospel message. And God the Father is the first gospel preacher. Well, when people hear the gospel is inherently a message of victory. Christ came to die on the cross, though he died in weakness. He was raised in great power. He died for our sins, rose again victoriously to break the power of sin. Now, even if you limit it to the individual, which is a mistake, that even for the individual is a message of victory. The gospel is not inherently a message of defeat.
Mm-hmm.
What postmillennialism does is it recognizes that this gospel message of victory is not victory only individualistically or ecclesially. It's also victory culturally. So what I'm saying is that why people, I think, that understand the power of the gospel would at least be attracted to it is because they know that, as Paul says in Romans 1, the gospel is the power of God to salvation. And so Christians that are strongly anti-postmillennial actually, I think, have to suppress this idea of the power of the gospel. Now, they would never say that because they would say the gospel is not designed to sort of transform the world. It's designed to transform individuals. But what they can't deny, Rick, is the gospel is inherently transformational.
Right.
I mean, the Bible clearly says that. So I just gently ask them to sort of be consistent with your own understanding of the nature of the gospel, that the gospel transforms us and our families and our societies, our churches and societies and outward. That's why I think this Why We Will Win appeals to people, because they know that the gospel is powerful. It's God's kingdom message. Christ came preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and he is the victorious king, and Jesus is Lord of all things. That actually intuitively, even people that don't understand all the theology and exegesis, should intuitively appeal to people.
Right. I mean, one question I like to ask people in talking about this, and it's a question lots of people have used, is, okay, you're preaching the gospel and it's going out into the world and it's powerful to save. So people are being converted and having faith in Christ. And the state senator in your church is now a believer and comes to the pastor and says, okay, how do I pass laws as a Christian? Or the president is a believer and says, how do I govern as a Christian? What do I do? I mean, it's essentially what happened with Constantine. He becomes a Christian and he turns to the Christian bishops and says, what do I do now?
That's right.
And if your answer is, well, nothing, the gospel doesn't say anything about that, I think you're really missing out, right? On what teaching.
Yeah, no, that's this is a real irony about that, is that there are a lot of Christians that say we believe in world evangelism. We believe in the Great Commission. The gospel should go to the world. But to believe in world evangelization is really to believe in world Christianization, because if we do evangelize the world, not meaning every single person, but a number of people, many people in the world are evangelized, well, presumably the gospel, not presumably, we know from the Bible it changes lives, not always immediately, but gradually. Well, as you point out, what happens about the senator in the church, and not just the senator, I would say, we think of politics. What about the architect in the church? What about the doctor in the church? What about the car salesman? What about the other businessmen and women and families, and how all of these people that are in positions to influence culture, they think differently as Christians than as non-Christians. Well, when they start thinking differently and applying that faith outside the walls of their family, their house, and their church, well, that's influencing culture in a postmillennial way. And to say that they shouldn't be doing that is really to say that you don't believe in sanctification, or that we're only to be sanctified like in our family devotions or when we're in church on Sunday. But the Bible just won't permit that. Jesus Christ is Lord of all things, whether we eat or drink or in whatever we do all to the glory of God. Well, if we're to glorify God in our eating and drinking, certainly we should glorify him in our voting. Certainly we should glorify him if we're a senator in bills that we support. Certainly we should glorify him if we're a doctor or a college professor and what we how we practice or what we teach. So these are sort of implicit postmillennial understandings that I wish more Christians would take account of.
Right. And even as you're talking, I'm even thinking of examples from scripture when the centurions come to John the Baptist and say, "What do we do?" He doesn't
Yes.
say, "Do your devotions every day."
Mm-hmm.
And
That's right.
When Zacchaeus is converted and goes to Jesus, "What do I do?" Jesus doesn't say, "Well, have quiet time." Yeah,
That's
you've got
right.
to make restitution. You've got to do your job in a godly way, and that's going to change the world around you. So
That's right. Yeah,
good stuff.
Christianity is not a private devotional hobby. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. So Christians in the last 100 years, Rick, have been very good at stressing one's vertical relationship to God,
Mhm.
and of course that's essential. If we lack that, we miss the boat. But the Bible won't limit it to the vertical. It's also the horizontal, and not just the horizontal in family and church, but in all of society and culture.
Right. Right. Well, thank you for this conversation. Our time is ticking away here, but this has been really fun. I wish we could actually keep it going for longer.
Maybe I can come
I
back
know.
sometime.
Well, I
Yes.
know you've got another book, Creational Worldview, I think is the name of it.
Yes.
And I have
Yeah.
not looked at that yet, but maybe we could have you back sometime to talk about that. Do you want
Uh,
to blurb it for us real quick?
I'd love that. Basically, point out and actually hand in glove with the Post Mill book because it's laying out the foundation of the creational norms. Many Christians, of conservative Christians, understand the importance of six-day creation, of Adam and Eve as actual historical figures, the universal Genesis flood, anti-Darwinist, and of course that's very clear. But that's not the extent of the biblical understanding of creation. And the Bible, creation structures all of life. The problem with evangelicals the last 150 or even 200 years has been that they are very strong on redemption, but have a very impoverished view of creation.
Hmm.
And because of that, that's one example. So many of them collapse so quickly before so-called same-sex marriage and same-sex attraction. I know several churches that say, well, we don't agree with it, but we're not going to address that because it's not a gospel issue. It's not a redemptive issue. But the fact is, it is. And one thing I do in the book is point out with these norms and demonstrate also how the ancient heresy of Gnosticism has infected even the conservative church.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I hope to have you back sometime. Maybe we can talk about that then.
Yes.
And I'll try to get my hands on your book and read it. This book, though, those watching Postmillennial Primer, you can get it on Amazon, and it's not a long read, so you can get through it in an afternoon or take your time to digest it. Dr. Sandlin, thank you for being here today, and you have a great week.
Thank you, Rick, for you and your podcast and your church. God bless you, brother.